The mountain town rested quietly between tall pine trees and long winding roads that few outsiders ever used. The air was clean and cold, and the people who lived there were used to silence. Among them lived a man named Caleb, a mountain man who chose a life far from noise and crowds. He lived alone in a small wooden cabin that he had built himself with slow, careful hands. Every log had a story, every nail had purpose, and nothing in his life existed without reason. Caleb woke every morning before the sun rose over the hills. He chopped wood, carried water, and checked the land around his cabin. He spoke little, but he observed everything. The forest felt like home to him in a way no town ever could. Animals trusted him because he never rushed them or forced his presence. He believed patience was stronger than force, and the mountains had taught him that lesson well. One afternoon, Caleb drove his old truck into town to collect supplies. The road was rough and narrow, bending around cliffs and tall trees. As he reached the edge of town, he noticed signs for a small livestock auction. Caleb usually avoided such gatherings, but something urged him to stop. He told himself it was only curiosity, nothing more. The auction ground was busy with people talking and moving between pens. The air carried the sounds of animals and boots against dirt. Chickens fluttered nervously, goats pulled against ropes, and horses stood quietly with tired eyes. Caleb walked slowly, hands in his jacket pockets, not looking for anything in particular. Then he felt it, a strange heaviness in his chest that made him stop walking. At the far end of the auction stood a large metal enclosure, bigger than the rest. Inside sat a dog so massive that it seemed unreal. Its fur was thick and dusty, its body powerful and calm. The dog did not bark or pace. It simply watched. People nearby whispered and laughed in uneasy voices. Some shook their heads and stepped away. Others stared from a distance, unsure what to think. The dog lifted its head and locked eyes with Caleb. Those eyes were steady and deep, filled with awareness rather than fear. Caleb stepped closer without thinking. A small sign hung on the enclosure that read "Unclaimed Guardian Dog." The auctioneer spoke about the animal in a hesitant tone, explaining that it came from a remote area where its owner had passed away. There were no records, no history, and no clear breed. Only stories about how the dog had guarded land and animals for years without trouble. The bidding began quietly. No hands went up. People shifted their weight and avoided eye contact. Someone joked that the dog ate more than a family of 5. Another person said it was too big to trust. The dog remained still, its gaze following Caleb as if waiting for something. Caleb felt a pull deep inside him. He thought about his cabin, the open land, the long winters, and the silence. He thought about how lonely the mountains could be at night. Without planning it, he raised his hand. The crowd turned toward him in surprise. Murmurs spread through the people standing nearby. The auctioneer paused, confirmed the bid, and looked around for higher offers. No one spoke. The hammer fell, and the decision was final. Caleb walked toward the enclosure as the gate opened. The dog stood up slowly, revealing its full size. It was taller than Caleb's waist and broader than any dog he had known. Still, it did not growl or step back. Caleb reached out carefully and placed his hand on the dog's thick fur. The warmth beneath his palm felt steady and calm. The dog leaned slightly into the touch. People watched in silence as Caleb led the dog toward his truck. The animal moved with surprising grace, climbing into the back and settling down as if it had done this many times before. Caleb closed the tailgate and sat in the driver's seat, his heart beating heavier than usual. The drive back into the mountains felt longer than before. The road twisted upward, trees closing in around the truck. The dog remained quiet, watching the forest pass by. As the truck climbed higher, the dog lifted its head and released a deep sound that echoed through the hills. Far away, birds scattered from treetops. Caleb did not know it yet, but the mountains had just accepted a new guardian. The truck climbed higher into the mountains as the sun lowered behind the trees and shadows stretched across the road. Caleb drove slowly, careful on the narrow path, while the giant dog stayed calm in the back of the truck. The forest felt different now, quieter but also more alert, as if something unseen was paying attention. Caleb could feel it in his chest, a mix of curiosity and caution, but he kept driving without turning back. When the truck finally stopped near the cabin, the air was cold and still. Caleb stepped out and opened the tailgate, unsure how the dog would react to its new surroundings. The dog jumped down with a heavy thud and stood still, taking in the land, the trees, and the cabin. Its head moved slowly from side to side, eyes scanning the forest like it already knew this place mattered. Caleb watched closely, ready to step in if needed, but the dog did nothing unexpected. It walked a slow circle around the cabin, sniffing the ground and the air. Its movements were careful and deliberate, not wild or uncertain. When it finished, it returned to Caleb and sat quietly, as if waiting for permission. Caleb nodded without realizing it, and opened the cabin door. The dog ducked its head and stepped inside, careful not to bump into anything. The cabin was small, but clean and sturdy. A fire pit sat in the center, and a wooden table stood near the wall. The dog sniffed the floor, then lay down near the door, choosing a spot that allowed it to see both inside and outside. That night, the wind picked up and moved through the trees with a low, restless sound. Caleb cooked a simple meal and shared some of it with the dog, who ate slowly and calmly. The dog showed no sign of hunger, panic, or aggression. After eating, it rested its head on its paws and watched the fire flicker. As the night grew deeper, a strange feeling settled over the land. The forest grew quiet in a way that felt heavy rather than peaceful. Caleb noticed it first when the insects stopped making noise. He stood and listened, his instincts alert. The dog lifted its head at the same moment, ears tilting toward the dark window. A low sound drifted through the trees, faint but steady. Caleb could not place it, but he knew it did not belong. The dog rose to its feet, its body tense but controlled. It stepped toward the door and stood there, blocking the entrance without being told. Caleb stayed still, trusting the dog's judgment. The sound outside grew closer, branches cracking under slow, careful movement. The dog let out a deep warning sound, strong and firm, echoing through the cabin walls. The noise outside stopped. For several long moments, nothing moved. Then the forest slowly came back to life, insects humming again and wind brushing through leaves. The dog relaxed slightly but did not leave the door. Caleb realized then that the dog was not just large, but trained by instinct and experience. The rest of the night passed quietly, but sleep came slowly. Caleb rested near the fire while the dog remained alert, watching the door until morning light touched the cabin walls. At sunrise, Caleb stepped outside and noticed something unusual. Fresh marks lined the ground near the trees, large and deep, but none crossed into the open space around the cabin. Whatever had been there had stopped short and turned away. Caleb looked at the dog, who stood calmly beside him, eyes focused on the forest. Word traveled fast in a small mountain town. Within days, people began noticing changes. Hunters spoke of paths feeling safer. Livestock owners found their animals calmer at night. Strange sounds that once echoed through the hills no longer came close to homes. Some townsfolk began to talk about Caleb and his giant dog. Some were curious, others uneasy. A few remembered old stories passed down through generations, stories of guardians that walked beside humans to protect the land. Most dismissed those stories as old myths meant to scare children. Caleb did not care for rumors. His days continued as before, but now the dog followed him everywhere. When Caleb chopped wood, the dog watched the tree line. When Caleb checked the land, the dog walked ahead, alert but peaceful. Their bond grew without words, built on trust and quiet understanding. One afternoon, Caleb noticed the dog standing still near the edge of the forest, staring into the distance. The air felt tense again, heavier than before. Caleb followed the dog's gaze and felt a chill move through him. Something had changed in the mountains, and this time it felt larger, closer, and more aware. The dog did not move, but its presence felt stronger, as if it were preparing for something it had done before. Caleb placed a hand on the dog's thick fur, feeling the steady strength beneath it. Whatever the mountains held, they would not face it alone. And deep within the forest, something ancient shifted and took notice. The mountains woke slowly under a pale morning sky, and Caleb felt the change before he saw it. The air carried a tight feeling, like the land itself was holding its breath. The giant dog stood near the cabin, body still, eyes fixed toward the higher ridges. It did not growl or move, but its presence felt heavier, stronger, as if it was standing between the cabin and something unseen. Caleb followed his daily routine, but every task felt sharper in his mind. He chopped wood with careful swings and scanned the tree line between strikes. The dog paced in wide circles, marking the land with calm confidence. Birds stayed higher in the trees, and smaller animals avoided the open clearing. The forest was watching. As the sun climbed, a distant sound rolled through the mountains. It was low and steady, not sudden, but powerful enough to make the ground feel alive. Caleb paused and listened. The dog stopped moving and faced uphill, ears forward, muscles tight. This sound was different from before. It carried weight and purpose. Caleb walked toward the edge of the clearing, careful with each step. He trusted the dog to lead, and the dog moved ahead, slow but certain. The trees grew closer together as they climbed, branches forming a thick cover above. Light faded, replaced by shadow and cold air. The sound grew clearer, like heavy movement pressing through old paths. They reached a narrow ridge where the land dropped sharply on one side. The dog stopped and stood tall, blocking Caleb's path. Caleb crouched slightly and looked past the dog. Below them, deep marks cut into the ground, far larger than anything he had seen before. The earth looked disturbed, as if something had moved through without fear of resistance. The dog released a deep, steady sound that vibrated through the trees. It was not a threat, but a warning. The forest answered with silence. Minutes passed slowly. Then the ground below shifted. A massive shape moved between the trees, tall and broad, its form hard to fully see through the shadows. Caleb's heart raced, but the dog did not step back. It held its ground, calm and unshaken. The shape stopped just short of the ridge. A long moment passed where nothing moved. Then the shape lowered itself, not in attack, but in recognition. Caleb felt a strange understanding settle over him. This was not a fight. This was something older. The dog stepped forward one pace, then stopped. Its posture was strong, proud, and clear. Whatever stood below responded by slowly backing away, melting into the forest without sound. The ground stilled. The air eased. Caleb released a breath he did not realize he was holding. He knelt and placed a hand on the dog's shoulder. The fur was warm and steady beneath his palm. The dog turned its head slightly and met his eyes. There was no fear there, only duty. They returned to the cabin as the forest slowly returned to life. Birds called again, and the wind moved freely through the branches. Caleb understood now that the dog was more than a guardian of land. It was a keeper of balance. News spread again through the mountain town. People spoke of strange tracks that stopped suddenly. Hunters found paths cleared and dangers avoided. Elders began sharing old stories once whispered by firelight. Stories of great guardians bound to the mountains, appearing only when the land called for them. Some townsfolk came to Caleb's cabin, standing at a respectful distance. They brought supplies, food, and quiet gratitude. Caleb accepted what was offered, but said little. The dog watched them calmly, allowing those with good intent to come close, and those with uneasy hearts to keep their distance. One evening, as the sun dipped low, the dog stood on a high rock near the cabin and looked across the valley. The mountains glowed with fading light. Caleb stood beside the dog, feeling small but steady. He realized that the dog had not been sold at an auction by chance. It had been waiting. As night fell, the forest remained calm. Whatever had stirred before stayed away. Deep within the land, old paths closed and balance settled once more. The mountains had chosen their guardian, and Caleb had become part of something far greater than himself. The bond between man and dog grew stronger, not through words, but through shared silence and trust. And though challenges still waited beyond the ridges, the mountains now stood protected by a presence that would not falter. The mountains settled into a deep calm after the encounter, as if a long-held breath had finally been released. Morning light spread gently across the valley, touching the trees and rocks with quiet warmth. Caleb stood outside his cabin, breathing in the crisp air, while the giant dog rested nearby, its body relaxed but aware. The land felt safe in a way Caleb had never known before. Days turned into weeks, and life found a new rhythm. Caleb continued his work as always, gathering wood, repairing fences, and walking the familiar trails. The dog stayed close, sometimes walking ahead, sometimes watching from a distance. Wherever it stood, the forest seemed to respect that space. Animals moved freely again, and the uneasy feeling that once haunted the nights did not return. People from the mountain town visited more often now. They spoke with gratitude and calm voices, no longer uneasy. Some brought stories of peaceful nights and protected livestock. Others brought food and supplies, leaving them quietly at the edge of the clearing. Caleb accepted their kindness with a nod, knowing words were not needed. The elders of the town spoke among themselves, sharing memories passed down through generations. They remembered stories of great guardians tied to the land, beings that appeared only when balance was threatened. Many believed those stories were meant to teach respect for nature. Now they wondered if those stories were also meant to prepare them. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the peaks, the dog walked to a high ridge near the cabin. Caleb followed and stood beside it. Together they looked over the valley, watching the light fade and stars begin to appear. The dog released a low steady sound that echoed gently across the mountains, not as a warning, but as a promise. Caleb felt a sense of belonging settle in his chest. He realized that the dog had not simply joined his life. Their paths had crossed because the land itself had chosen them. Caleb was no longer just a man living in the mountains. He was a caretaker, standing beside a guardian older than any story he had heard. Seasons began to change, and winter approached with heavy clouds and cold winds. Snow covered the trails, but the cabin stayed warm and safe. The dog moved easily through deep snow, breaking paths and watching the tree line. No danger crossed into the valley. The mountains stood quiet and protected. On a clear winter night, Caleb stepped outside and looked at the sky. Stars stretched endlessly above him, bright and sharp. The dog stood beside him, its breath rising in slow clouds. Caleb placed a hand on its thick fur and smiled softly. He felt grateful for the auction that had brought them together and for the silent bond they now shared. Far across the ridges, the land rested peacefully. Old forces that once stirred stayed hidden, aware that the balance had been restored. The guardian remained watchful, and the man remained humble. Together they formed a quiet promise between the mountains and those who lived among them. And so the story of the mountain man and the giant dog became part of the land itself. Not spoken loudly or written in books, but carried in the wind, the trees, and the calm hearts of those who felt safer beneath the watchful peaks.